Component events. Hello everybody, this is Ben Finkel, and in this nugget I want to talk about the third and final piece of our components that make them the core of any React user interface, and that's events. Alongside of props and state, they make components what they are. At this point, we understand that components have properties. Properties are immutable values passed down to that component from some parent object that tell it how to render, how to draw itself into the HTML. And also we know that components are not static. They can change. They're user interface elements, and user interfaces often change over time. And to represent that changing state, well, we use something called state. But of course that raises a question. If the state can be changed, how does it know when to change? What causes the state to update or to change our component to re-render and draw itself differently than it did the last time? And the answer to that is something we call events. Now, if you're familiar with event-driven programming, this should be very familiar, comfortable territory for you. If you've worked with events inside of JavaScript, inside of the DOM and HTML, also going to be very familiar, comfortable territory for you, because React.js events are just browser events that they've kind of wrapped around. What happens is any action, any user interaction gets trapped as an event, if you want it to, inside of your browser. That includes mouse clicks or touches, presses if you have a touchscreen interface. It can also include non-user interactions, things like timers or intervals. So you can have your application set up to trigger an event every 30 seconds or every minute or every hour, whatever the case might be. And each of these events is filtered through a function inside of your component, which then tells your component to re-render itself, redraw itself. And from there it goes off to the virtual DOM, and React handles all of the mechanics of redrawing it to your HTML page, which is nice. So all you're really worried about is this little element here, capturing the event, deciding what state changes should occur due to that event, and then propagating that out into your render function. What I've just described is more or less the browser's event model, but React puts a wrapper around all that, like I said, and it handles it a little more cleanly and a little more easily for you. First of all, the object that gets passed into your function is actually called a synthetic event. It's a React-specific element that wraps around the browser's event object, and that's what gets passed into your function here, like I showed off in this little example. Here's my increment function, which is handling on the onClick event, and I'm taking in this syn event object. The difference between event from your browser and the synthetic event that React produces is that it kind of cleans up and normalizes all of the different variances between browsers and between versions of browsers that you might be using. So what you know with the synthetic event is that it's always going to handle exactly the same regardless of the browser, the client environment that might be using your application. And that's really ideal. You don't have to program for a whole bunch of different browsers. You can simply program once, treat this event the way you would expect events to be treated inside of a browser, and know that it will function exactly the same across all of the different browsers. So events in React.js are uniform across browsers, like I just said. They're consistent with the W3C specification, which I've linked down here. If you want to learn more about the official technical specification for events that the W3C publishes, that's right here. React, it conforms to that standard. And of course, events are simple JSON objects. That means you can manipulate and work with event objects however you see fit. Now let's take a look at a couple of examples of how we can use events inside of React components. I've got a quick fiddle up here, and it looks just like the fiddle that I was working with in a different nugget on component state. What it's got specifically is it's got the thing I added to at the end of that, which is the onClick event inside of my button. So first of all, onClick, that looks like any other JavaScript onClick event that you would put inside of code. But of course, this is in JSX, which means I don't set it equal to a string. I set it equal to a little escaped JavaScript code piece called this .increment. What is this? Well, this of course is click counter, my click counter component, and the .increment function is right here. There's increment, the function. And all this does inside of increment is I call a this.setState. So again, going back to our state nugget, you understand that you have to call this.setState when you want to update the state of your component, and that's what tells React to do the whole virtual DOM re-render process to ensure that you get a nice clean re-rendering of your HTML document. So check this out. Just as is, I've been clicked 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Every time I click it, that state increments. React is handling the redrawing of that button with the correct number in it. It's handling remembering the state for me and incrementing that state every single time. All I need was my simple onClick function there. And again, I don't care what browser I'm in, i.e. Mozilla, Opera, I'm in Chrome right here. It's always going to work exactly the same. So if you've dealt with any of those weird quirks such as key press and key up and key down events and the weird way that those events kind of work inside of different browsers, you don't need to worry about that here. They're all going to work exactly the way that the W3C specification tells you they should work. Now take a look at this fiddle I've got up on screen here. This is a great, short, little, easy to understand example of state and properties and events all rolled into one, and it's very straightforward. So the top half is a clicker children component, and the bottom half is a second component called clicker. Now let's talk about clicker first. That's going to be kind of my parent component here. And all that's doing, you see in the render function, is it's just rendering a clicker children element. That's all I do. But I also have one other thing. I've got this announce function here. And announce function, you can see, takes an event object. Announce is what I want to respond to the click event on my buttons. But here's the thing. My buttons are not inside of clicker. They're inside of clicker children. Here's where I return a bunch of buttons. Button 1, button 2, button 3. And I want to handle the on-click event down here. But how do I bubble up the on-click event down here up into the parent object? And the answer is properties. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come along here to clicker children, and I'm going to say on child click equals this dot announce. Notice I don't have to pass in the event object. That's going to be handled for me behind the scenes by the browser. But on child click is not a real event. And in fact, it's on a clicker children. It's not even on a button element. So if you're confused, don't be, because what I've actually done here is I've created a new property inside of my clicker children. Remember, properties can be set by the parent component. So it's immutable from the perspective of clicker children, but from the parent's perspective, from clicker, it can be set and defined by the clicker function. So now I have a property called onChildClick, and down here what I can simply do is say this.props.onChildClick. I can paste this little bit of code into each of my on-click events on each of my individual components. And let's go ahead and run this. Click me. Look at that. You clicked button 1. So I got my event. Oops. Got to get the right pen component there. I got my my object passed right up into the event object. And if I click OK and I say or me, you can see now it reads button 2. And even me, it reads button 3. So again, just to recap what exactly happened here, by setting up onChildClick right here, I created a new property inside of the property bag of clicker children. Just this instance of clicker children, by the way. And then this instance of clicker children references that through the this.props.onChildClick. And it hands that off to the onClick event, which means it bubbles up and it fires this event inside of the parent function. By the way, I passed in the event object so that I could get event.target.name, and that's what showed inside of my alert box. So that concludes this nugget on component events for React.js. So to recap, components are made up of props and state. Props are immutable values that get passed from a parent component of some kind that tell the object how to render. State are also properties that tell the object how to render, but they're not immutable. State can be changed specifically by the object itself. How do we know when to change, though? We respond to events. Events are any action, user-generated or otherwise, that might update the state of our component. If they do, we change the state accordingly, re-render to the virtual DOM, and carry on. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.